All right, so let's dive into the first theory of personality called the psychoanalytic theory. Now, you've probably heard of someone super famous in the psychology world named Sigmund Freud. Well, it so happens, fun fact here, that Freud was not even a psychologist. He was a physician, more specifically a neurologist. And in 1885, he went to Paris to study hypnosis with a fellow neurologist. But this experience is actually what turned him towards medical psychopathology. And psychiatry, as we know it, was actually unknown at the time Freud began his work. So there you have it. There's your history lesson for the day. The psychoanalytic theory says that our childhood experiences and unconscious desires influence behavior. So this is a key word for this theory, unconscious. So our personalities have memories, beliefs, urges, drives, and instincts that we are not always aware of, and that make up this unconscious. And the major driving force behind Freud's instinctual theory is the concept of libido. And you may have heard of this in a different context, but we'll go over it in terms of this theory. So libido is natural energy source that fuels the mechanisms of the mind. And when this libidinal energy is stuck or fixated at various stages of psychosexual development, there's another key word. So when this fixation occurs at psychosexual development and stages, conflicts can occur that have lifelong effects. So fixation at a particular stage is what predicts adult personality, according to this theory. For example, someone fixated at the oral stage, which is actually the first stage in psychosexual development, might have oral personality characteristics like being overly talkative or having a smoking habit when they grow up.
Freud proposed that personality development in childhood takes place during 5 psychosexual stages, which are the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stages. During each stage, sexual energy, also known as libido, is expressed in different ways and through different parts of the body. These are called psychosexual stages because each stage represents the fixation of libido on a different area of the body. As a person grows physically, certain areas of their body become important as sources of potential frustration, pleasure, or both.
Okay, so Freud breaks down those mental structures I was talking about into 3 parts. And we can look at this by looking at an iceberg. So let's break this down into 2 parts first. The top of the iceberg, which is shown up here above the surface of the water, is the conscious part of our mind. So this is everything we are aware of. And if that's the conscious, what do you think this bottom is? If you said unconscious, you are right. So it's the unconscious mind. Now what do you notice? The unconscious is a lot larger than the conscious. You know that saying, it's only the tip of the iceberg that we see? Well, it's true. Most of our mind is hidden below the surface.
In psychoanalytic terms, the unconscious does not include all that is not conscious, but rather what is actively repressed from conscious thought, or what a person is averse to knowing consciously. Freud viewed the unconscious as a repository for socially unacceptable ideas, wishes or desires, traumatic memories, and painful emotions put out of mind by the mechanism of psychological repression. However, the contents did not necessarily have to be solely negative. In the psychoanalytic view, the unconscious is a force that can only be recognized by its effects. In a sense, this view places the conscious self as an adversary to its unconscious, warring to keep the unconscious hidden. Unconscious thoughts are not directly accessible to ordinary introspection, but are supposed to be capable of being tapped and interpreted by special methods and techniques such as meditation, free association, dream analysis, and verbal slips, commonly known as a Freudian slip, examined and conducted during psychoanalysis. Seeing as these unconscious thoughts are normally cryptic, psychoanalysts are considered experts in interpreting their messages.
Okay, let's go into the first structure of our mind, and that is the id. So the id is located down here in this compartment, and it's the unconscious part of our mind that makes up most of the mind. It's hidden below the surface, and it develops right after birth and demands immediate gratification.
The id is the instinctual component of personality that is present at birth and is the source of bodily needs and wants, emotional impulses and desires, especially aggression and the libido. The id acts according to the pleasure principle, which are the psychic force oriented to immediate gratification of impulse, desire and avoidance of pain. Freud said that the id is unconscious, by definition as it's the dark, inaccessible part of our personality. What little we know of it, we have learned from our study of the dream work and the construction of neurotic symptoms, and most of that is of a negative character and can be described only as a contrast to the ego. We approach the id with analogies. We call it a chaos, a cauldron full of seething excitations. The id is filled with energy reaching it from the instincts, but it has no organization, produces no collective will, but only a striving to bring about the satisfaction of the instinctual needs subject to the observance of the pleasure principle.
Now, the second part of this structure is the ego. So the ego is right here in this compartment, and it's part of our conscious and our unconscious mind. Okay, we'll see why that's the case in a little bit. But the ego is involved in our perceptions, thoughts, and judgments, and it seeks long-term gratification as opposed to the id's immediate gratification.
The reality principle that operates the ego is a regulating mechanism that enables the individual to delay gratifying immediate needs and function effectively in the real world. An example would be to resist the urge to grab other people's belongings, but instead to purchase those items. The ego is the organized part of the personality structure that includes defensive, perceptual, intellectual, cognitive, and executive functions. Conscious awareness resides in the ego, although not all of the operations of the ego are conscious. Originally, Freud used the word ego to mean a sense of self, but later revised it to mean a set of psychic functions such as judgment, tolerance, reality testing, control, planning, defense, synthesis of information, intellectual functioning, and memory. The ego helps us to organize our thoughts and make sense of them in relation to the world around us. The ego is that part of the id which has been modified by the direct influence of the external world. Therefore, the ego represents what may be called reason and common sense, in contrast to the id, which contains the passions.
And the third compartment, right over here, is the superego. Now, the superego develops around the age of 4, and it's our moral compass or our conscience. Don't get that confused with conscious. Conscience, the little tongue twister.
The superego reflects the internalization of cultural rules, mainly taught by parents applying their guidance and influence. Freud developed his concept of the superego from an earlier combination of the ego ideal and the special psychical agency which performs the task of seeing that narcissistic satisfaction from the ego ideal is ensured, what we call our conscience. For Freud, the installation of the superego can be described as a successful instance of identification with the parental agency, while as development proceeds the superego also takes on the influence of those who have stepped into the place of parents, such as educators, teachers, people chosen as ideal models. The superego aims for perfection as it forms the organized part of the personality structure, mainly but not entirely unconscious. This includes the individual's ego ideals, spiritual goals, and the psychic agency, commonly called conscience, that criticizes and prohibits their drives, fantasies, feelings, and actions. The superego can be thought of as a type of conscience that punishes misbehavior with feelings of guilt.
Okay, so let's go back to these psychosexual stages I was talking about. So our libidinal impulses, right here, are what want to be gratified. And when they are either over-gratified or not gratified at all or partially gratified, fixation occurs at a psychosexual stage, and we face either conflict or anxiety. Now, what I mean by conflict is not this whole battle or drama that plays out, but it's a conflict between these 3 mental structures of our mind, the ego, the superego, and the id, because all of them are competing for demands. So they're in a conflict.
Fixation refers to the theoretical notion that a portion of the individual's libido has been permanently invested in a particular stage of their development. Some people do not seem to be able to leave one stage and proceed on to the next. One reason for this may be that the needs of the developing individual at any particular stage may not have been adequately met, in which case there is frustration. Or possibly the person's needs may have been so well satisfied that they are reluctant to leave the psychological benefits of a particular stage in which there is overindulgence. Both frustration and overindulgence, or any combination of the two, may lead to what psychoanalysts call fixation at a particular psychosexual stage.
Think of it like this. I'm going to draw out ourselves right here, like that, and there's the rest of us. You get the picture. Okay. Whoa, this person has really big arms, but you get the idea. Okay, so think of it like this. we have the id sitting on one shoulder over here. And this is us looking. We're in a little bit of a conflict. Okay, so the id is sitting on one shoulder here, and it's really, really upset because it's demanding gratification and it isn't immediately getting it. Remember, I said it wants immediate gratification. But then over here, you have this superego. And the superego is sitting on its high horse, and it's preaching to the id about what's moral. And then what about the ego? What happens to the ego? What role does that have? Well, it's going to be in the middle because the id wants gratification and only gratification. And it's going back and forth with the superego. So the ego right over here is trying to gratify the id, but it also has to take into account what the superego is saying. The superego's moral oversight, which represents the values of society. Now remember I said earlier that the ego is part of the conscious and the unconscious minds. So it basically acts as a mediator between the unconscious desires of the id and the moral demands of the superego. So have you ever heard of a Freudian slip? That's actually an example of a mental conflict. So for example, a financially stressed patient tells his doctor, "Oh, doctor, please don't give me any bills." Well, what he really meant to say was, "Please don't give me any pills." So this whole process that I went through of the ego, the superego, and the id becoming fixated in psychosexual development due to conflicts is all part of the psychoanalytic theory. And this process is part of personality development for all individuals, but it's especially problematic when there's a problem with gratification in a particular psychosexual stage.